Good evening, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming at relatively short notice to this event, not quite as short notice as we had for the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia a few weeks ago, courtesy of High Commissioner Alexander Downer, but still it's, as I always say, as Stalin said in the matter of arms production, eventually enough quantity becomes quality, and we have both quantity and quality here tonight in terms of the audience, and notably, of course, in the person of our guest speaker, Minister Dutton, and the area of immigration and demography is a subject of great interest to us at Policy Exchange. I remember some years ago using more colourful language than I'm now able to summon up on a family occasion such as this. Sir Linton Crosby said that the area of immigration, and particularly the whole discussion in this country of Australia's point system, was the only public policy initiative of any foreign government that the British people had ever heard of. And so it's a sign of the continuing importance of the matter that the Minister is here at the right time, at the right moment, to be able to address these issues. He's very kindly agreed to answer questions afterwards, and as the usual House rule, no question too outrageous. You simply have to indicate your name and organisation before asking questions, and of course coming out of the contact sport that is Australian politics, he will be well equipped to field any of these outrageous slings of fortune. So without further ado, over to you, Minister. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time to come to us on your trip to the UK.
Well, Dean, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership here at the Policy Exchange. It's great to be back in London. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. So can I firstly start by saying thank you very much to Dean for the invitation. I acknowledge our High Commissioner here in London, Alexander Downer, whose father, as you know, was one of my ministerial predecessors from 1958 to 1963. I'd also like to acknowledge the Secretary of my department, Michael Bazzulo, and the Deputy Secretary of my department, Rachel Noble. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, migration has regained prominence in our respective countries. It was a major theme of the past 3 Australian elections, as it was in your referendum on Brexit, and certainly as it was in the presidential election in the United States last year. Now, this has not been unique to the English-speaking world either, as evidenced by the rise of populist anti-migration parties in Europe, most recently in Germany only last weekend. Even in Southeast Asia, popular concern about migration has been a feature in national politics. And a key driver for this prominence is the very high level of irregular migration across the world today. The United Nations estimates put the figure at somewhere near 65 million, the number of people who are displaced worldwide, roughly a third of whom are fleeing persecution. The emergence of a lucrative, profit-oriented people smuggling trade has boosted the scale of today's irregular mass movements. Countless individuals, most economic migrants, have intentionally circumvented immigration controls, moving between and through nations in an uncontrolled manner. Now, between January 2014 and March of this year, some 3.2 million people arrived irregularly into Europe alone, testing national border controls and public tolerance. Most tragically, on average, 10 men, women and children have died every day since the emergency began in mid-2013, some 15,000 souls in total. Now, this mass irregular migration has coincided with broader public anxiety about legal migration, weak economic growth, disruption from transformative technology and global markets, and security concerns sharpened by the graphic evil of ISIL. It is worth noting that in the Australian context, support for migration actually remains relatively strong and indeed has strengthened over recent years. The Australian Scanlon Foundation's 2016 survey demonstrated broad support for migration of 59% and even higher for skilled and family reunion migration. Now, I think there are 3 basic explanations for Australia's situation. The first is that migration is intrinsic in our national identity, as much as it is our economic fortune, and is widely seen as such. Secondly, that public support can't be taken for granted. Secure borders are fundamental to a well-managed and truly compassionate migration program that is capable of securing public backing. And thirdly, that migration policy cannot be set and forget. That is, it must be constantly adjusted. Australian governments, if not of course all governments, have a duty to ensure that migration works first and foremost for its citizens, not just the migrants themselves. So I want to begin with a few words about Australia's migration program. And it's arguable that Australia's first effort at a managed migration program, of course, began a little over 230 years ago, when the first fleet of 11 ships departed Portsmouth carrying some 1,300 convicts, Marines and crew to Australia. So for most of its first 100 years or so, Australia was a British-bred outpost, with the gold rush-induced Chinese migration of the mid-19th century a notable exception. Indeed, by federation in 1901, 78% of the young nation still hailed from these shores. Now, even as the father of our federation, Sir Henry Parkes, sought a nation to, quote, to master our own destinies and to win our own position in the world. And he also wished, again to continue the quotation, to remain side by side with that dear old England that we all love so well. And indeed, UK-born residents remained Australia's largest such group until continental-born Europeans brought to Australia in the post-World War period surpassed them around 1961. Our post-war migration program is lauded today as the start of a modern diverse society. In the past 7 decades, around 7 million people have migrated to Australia, bearing in mind that our population today is only just 24 million. But we should remember that the program was in fact a carefully targeted one, established against the backdrop of the Second World War, when the relentless advance of Imperial Japan threatened our nation's very existence. The post-war migration had a clear purpose: to build our population, to give Australia strategic weight in a region beset by post-colonial instability and communist threat. And the program was also discerning. Governments of the day deliberately sought out those who were young, skilled and physically strong. Officials were even instructed to seek out the attractive. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the success of that element of the policy. But by 1971, 1 in 3 Australians was a post-war migrant or the child of one, and mostly European. But from 1966, Australia's migration program was already expanding its geographic scope. Today, Australia is truly and very proudly a migrant nation. 1 in 4 was born overseas, and nearly 1 in 2 has a parent who was born overseas. Now, our major source countries for permanent migration, as you'd expect, are now India and China, which combined represent 3 times the number of UK citizens who migrated to Australia in 2016-17. At the same time, centre-right coalition governments have moved to ensure that the migration program focuses squarely on serving the national interest. In 1996, the Howard government's deliberate recalibration of the program towards supporting both temporary and permanent skilled migration helped to fill skills gaps and enable our economy to grow faster than it otherwise might have. So today, around 2/3 of Australia's annual planning ceiling of 190,000 permanent places is filled by skilled migrants. Properly managed and well-targeted skilled migration expands opportunities, it improves living standards, increases productivity and helps our country to reduce the budget deficit. Skilled migration makes Australia more internationally competitive and has helped our nation achieve more than 20 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And indeed, the Migration Council of Australia estimates that migration will add $1.6 trillion to Australia's GDP and 16% of workforce participation by 2050. Temporary migration is also increasingly important. More than 560,000 foreign students have helped make education our 3rd most important export, worth nearly $22 billion in 2016 alone. It's small wonder then that Australians continue to support migration that is well managed. But in recent years, the support has been tested by failed border security policies. A strong border is vital for any country seeking to maintain national sovereignty and integrity in migration. Border control is the means by which we choose who and what enters our country, which in turn impacts our society, our security and our prosperity. Although Australia does not share a land border with any nation, we face challenges in maintaining our sea borders, offshore jurisdictions and exclusive economic zones. We are the largest nation in the world to be surrounded by water. Our coastline, including our islands, measures just under 60,000 kilometres. Our continent is immense, yet our relatively small population is concentrated in cities and towns on the east coast. Our nearest neighbour, Papua New Guinea, lies just a few kilometres north of Australian territory, yet most people smuggling ventures come from much further away, making them difficult to find, interdict and turn back. Still, hard-learned lessons of our recent past have placed Australia well to deal with today's tough international environment. Prime Minister John Howard's strong border protection measures had reduced the total number of illegal boats to 16 during his last 5 years in office. Yet following his departure in 2007, a series of naive policy errors by successive Labor governments resulted in Australia being heavily targeted by people smuggling cartels. The Rudd government's decision to dismantle Prime Minister Howard's border protection measures was framed at the time as a compassionate one, but there was nothing compassionate about the human misery that followed. Indeed, between 2008 and 2013, some 50,000 people arrived illegally into our country on more than 800 boats. In comparison, at the height of the Indochina crisis of the 1970s, some 2,000 people arrived on 56 boats over a similar period between 1976 and 1981. Now, between 2008 and 2013, this is the most tragic part. At least 1,200 men, women and children lost their lives attempting that journey. The horrific scenes played out in the Mediterranean were occurring on the coast of Northern Australia, with Australian personnel regularly pulling bodies from the water. The then government opened 17 immigration detention centres to process the huge influx. More than 8,000 children entered into detention, peaking at almost 2,000 at one point in time in July of 2013. So the loss of sovereignty and the humanitarian disaster that flowed from those mistakes at the border resulted in a collapse of public confidence in migration. It was also very much a major contributing factor to the change of government in 2013. The coalition was elected at least in part, on a platform of taking back control of Australia's migration program from the people smugglers. And it's now been more than 3 years since the last successful people smuggling venture. But most importantly, the deaths at sea have stopped. All of the children have been removed from detention and the 17 detention centres have closed. Now, this outcome was achieved through the resolute implementation of strong border protection measures and the stand-up of Operation Sovereign Borders. Now, Operation Sovereign Borders, also known as OSB, is a military-led border security operation supported and assisted by a wide range of federal government agencies. A key component of OSB has been turning back people smuggling ventures where it is safe to do so. In fact, since commencing this policy, we've safely returned 31 ventures carrying 771 people and not one person has died. The policy of turnbacks, as you are well aware, is not without its critics, but it has saved lives. Had we allowed those 31 boats through, many hundreds would have followed and the deaths would have recommenced. And turnbacks show why governments must approach border protection in a clear-eyed and rational way, but we can't forget the terrible costs of misguided compassion. Australia has also used policy to deprive people smugglers of a product to sell to vulnerable people. We made it firm policy that anyone who arrives illegally by boat will never settle permanently in our country. Temporary protection visas and offshore processing send a very clear message that there is no point risking your life on a dangerous journey to our country. The reality is that it is working. At the height of the crisis, passengers were paying up to $20,000 to get to Australia. The success of OSB saw the price fall quickly to as little as $1,000. But even then, most, but not all, are unwilling to believe the people smugglers' lies. For this reason, we retain as part of our Operation Sovereign Borders strategy a strategic communications effort targeting potential clients in source and transit countries with facts about the perils of an illegal boat journey to Australia. And we provide significant financial support, indeed almost $53 million this year, to the work of the International Organisation for Migration in Indonesia and other non-government entities, where some 14,000 potential illegal migrants are waiting for the first sign of a policy shift. Now, more than anything, the Turnbull government knows it cannot waver on this policy. We know that a strong border is vital, not just for our security, but a strong border has also positioned Australia to act as a compassionate, generous and responsible global citizen and remain one of the top 3 settlement nations. Strong borders delivered the public confidence necessary for a one-off additional refugee intake of 12,000 persecuted minorities displaced by conflict in Syria and Iraq. I doubt that the public would have supported the government had we continued to face daily boat arrivals. The government has just delivered the largest offshore humanitarian program since 1983 at some 20,000 places, and we've increased the 2017-18 humanitarian program to 16,250 places, and it will further increase to 18,750 places in 2018-19. So as a government, we're introducing a new community support program to enable Australians to support genuine refugees and to ease the burden on taxpayers by taking refugees from camps and conflict zones, but in a manner that is tightly controlled. Rather than incentivising dangerous sea journeys, Australia is acting in the most compassionate and fair manner possible. In restoring the security and integrity of the border, we've also restored integrity and confidence in our overall migration program. Which brings me to the third point that I wish to make about Australia's experience, that a well-managed migration program is one that adjusts to ensure it continues to serve the interests of Australians. Australia's Productivity Commission expects migration to add another 13 million people to our population by 2060. And whilst the Commission sees a demographic and economic dividend, it advises that gains will depend on having a system that attracts younger migrants who are more skilled. It also advises that we need to get our social, economic, environmental, and I would argue at the top of that list, security policy settings right. And that is why the government is adjusting its migration and border policies to counter threats to Australia's security, to meet the reasonable expectation of Australians that migrants share and uphold our values and laws, and to ensuring skilled migration continues to serve our national interest. And despite our relative geographic isolation, Australia is certainly not immune to threats from terrorism, organised crime and foreign espionage. Australia has thankfully not suffered a mass casualty terror attack like those perpetrated here in this country, but we have experienced 5 attacks since the terror alert level was raised to probable in September of 2014. Our agencies have thwarted a further 13 imminent attacks, and more than 70 people have been arrested for terror-related offences. Now, this threat is foreign influenced, and we're alert to the opportunity of growing traveller and trade volume for terrorists and organised criminals. In fact, last financial year, Australia processed more than 40 million air and sea travellers and expects a 20% increase by 2019-20. And of course, it's a similar story for cargo. We're benefiting from an increasing mobile and expanding middle class in our region, free trade agreements and advancements in technology and communication. But we're also being exposed to the threats. We need to be able to interdict quickly, at greater distance, and in a more complex border environment. So to do this, we are modernising our systems through innovative migration products and delivery models, including the use of artificial intelligence that aligns and underpins Australia's economic, social and national security objectives. So while structural changes to Australia's visa and migration arrangements are on the horizon, we're already putting in place technologies and big data analytics to help us streamline border flows for legitimate travellers and traders and focus enforcement on the small minority who would seek to do us harm. In 2016, the government invested $100 million in a new visa risk assessment capability that uses sophisticated analytical modelling of big data and recurring assessment of visa holders to identify the potential threats and to defeat them. We're also investing in a complementary high-volume, multimodal biometric matching and analytical capability. The capability dovetails with Australia's investment into smart gates, which uses facial recognition technology to match biometric information stored in e-passports. In fact, last year, more than 16 million passengers, including children, used the smart gates to depart the country, an average of more than 40,000 people each day. But into the future, our goal is for biometric technology to process safely and accurately travellers through our airports without requiring them to produce a passport at all. And these measures will strengthen the integrity of our immigration program, but we're also strengthening the system for those who have already arrived in Australia. Australians, by their very nature, are welcoming, tolerant and forgiving. But they rightly ask why we would welcome and tolerate a miscreant minority, even if the vast majority of migrants contribute to our nation. The government agrees and won Parliament's approval to strengthen its powers to cancel the visas of serious criminals. So in the past 3 years alone, nearly 3,000 serious criminals have had their visas cancelled, including convicted armed robbers, murderers, rapists and child sex offenders. 230 years on, I might say we've returned the favour in cancelling the visas of more than 300 UK criminals, enabling their removal back to the UK. I'm pleased that the Australian Federal Police is here tonight to oversee this event. Now, similarly, the government is seeking to strengthen the institution of Australian citizenship. We've already revoked the citizenship of those who have obtained it by fraud and deception and enabled the revocation of Australian citizenship of dual nationals engaged in terrorism. But we want to strengthen the institution of citizenship by ensuring it is more than just an admin process. We want aspiring citizens to share in and uphold the same values that are held dearly by all Australians. And this has become increasingly important as the diversity of our country has grown and evidenced in cultural practices such as child marriage and female genital mutilation, which are completely contrary to our values. We think it reasonable that migrants wishing to become Australian citizens have a competent level of English, as the Productivity Commission has itself found that English ability is a major determinant of a person's ability to integrate successfully and prosper in what is an increasingly services-based economy. The government's also working to tailor our migration program to our nation's needs and the public's expectations. Indeed, earlier this year, the government announced changes to Australia's temporary skilled migration program, a program intended as a complement to Australian workers to address skills shortages or fill strategic skills needs. And it had ballooned under our predecessors. Public confidence in the integrity of the program fell as their concern about abuses in the program rose. So we abolished the old program and we've replaced it with one which is more sharply focused on the skills that Australia needs with much tighter rules to match. Foreign workers, including from the United Kingdom, are of course still welcome and are able to be employed in Australia where there is a genuine need for their skills. Indeed, Australia remains committed to a migration program that is biased towards skilled migration that meets the needs of Australia and its people. As always, we'll keep the settings under constant review, but with a ceiling of 190,000 permanent places per year, Australia's current migration intake is high in historical terms. Last year, a little over 183,000 permanent places were filled, with our refugee and humanitarian intake in addition to this. Now, still, the government must remain flexible, ensuring the ceiling fits within the expectations of the public, an incredibly important piece of the success to any future policy decisions. Our capacity to deliver the infrastructure needs to support it, and most importantly of all, it continues to provide real benefits for Australian citizens. They must be the tests. So, ladies and gentlemen, finally, I want to conclude with a few remarks about the bilateral relationship. The United Kingdom, of course, remains for us an enduring partner. Both of our societies have changed and have evolved incredibly since that first fleet departed for Australia in May of 1787. But they remain underwritten by common truths, that our individual and shared interests are bettered by democracy, the rule of law, free speech and the reward of individual enterprise. Our geography may be a little closer for the passage of time, but our relationship continues to deepen. Indeed, I foresee even closer cooperation following Prime Minister Turnbull's announcement of a new Home Affairs portfolio. And as a Minister-designate in that portfolio, I'm very proud that it will see a deepening of the relationship between our two countries. There is an incredible amount for us to learn from our respective experiences. I want to acknowledge very much the friendship and good working relationship with Home Secretary Rudd, and we met with Amber and her officials again today. But in Australia, the United Kingdom will always find a reliable and pragmatic friend and ally, much as we find in the United Kingdom. Long may it remain so. Once again, thank you very much for being here tonight.
How do you want to take questions?
Oh, I'm happy to abide by your rules.
One of the things when you're a shorter person always takes the higher platform here at Policy Exchange. When we had Chris Grayling, he was actually scraping the ceiling, so we had to lower the... Any questions? Name and organisation.
Stephen Sherborne from the House of Lords. You talked about revoking the citizenship of people who had acquired it through fraud. If they have not got dual citizenship, what is the process by which you remove them and where do they go?
Well, we don't render people stateless. So if somebody is not a dual national, if they're an Australian citizen, it's not possible for us to render them stateless, and that's a principle that we abide by, both in terms of criminal behaviour and in the more recent construct in terms of terrorist-related activity as well. So the underpinning assumption continues to be that we don't render people stateless.
Next question. Anyone? Gentleman there. Yeah, name and organisation, please.
Jeffrey Sterling, House of Lords and P&O. We talked about P&O bringing...
Jeffrey, can you take the microphone?
We talked about P&O bringing in some of the early passengers, shall we say. When you look at what's happened in America and other places and in this country, when people come in and they're skilled and they earn money and they have education, do you think that people are still integrating socially in a way that leads to real happiness, or are they still keeping little ghettos in those areas?
Well, certainly the reality for Australia since white settlement is that people have concentrated their efforts on work and repatriation with family and communities predominantly in the southern states and certainly on the east coast. So even today, people will rotate to Sydney and Melbourne, to the outer cities of both of those cities. Also to Brisbane, to a lesser extent Perth, but that's the reality, which creates a discussion in Australia about the infrastructure to which I referred in my remarks, and the support for those people to have a successful integration journey. I think it is made harder in societies where we have a passive welfare system, or where there is significant support for people, and at the heart of the citizenship changes that we're proposing at the moment, it is as one of the fundamental core requirements before people go on to citizenship. We're asking that people who are able-bodied and of working age, that they are working, that they are engaged, and that they can demonstrate that in the run-up period toward their application for Australian citizenship. So I think it's something that we need to continue to watch. I don't think we have, and I'm a foreign observer obviously, but I don't think we have some of the concentrations of populations or issues that we might see in parts of the United Kingdom. But nonetheless, it's a watching brief, and it needs to be the case that people are encouraged to integrate the proper support services. The High Commissioner for Refugees from the UN that I met in France last year believed that Australia, along with Canada, had the best settlement services in the world. So there's a lot of support that we provide to newly arrived refugees in particular, to help them get over language barriers, to help them find the support mechanisms to get into work, to engage children in schools, etc. But it's not without problem, and it's something we continue to concentrate on very much so.
Lady there in the front row there, yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you. Hi, Katrina Cooper, PwC. You've spoken a lot about history, but I'm curious to know in terms of future, you know, the way of the working world is really changing, and, you know, Australia is always seen as being, you know, very innovative in terms of their immigration policy, but obviously the recent changes to the 457 have pulled the mash really out of a lot of my clients. So, you know, what sort of innovative approach is the Australian government really going to look towards in terms of that working world and the new working world? So that was one question. The second one, sorry, I'll be cheeky and answer two. You know, given that the Australian government and both the UK government are both, I guess, looking at immigration very closely, how strongly are you going to work together to really develop strong reciprocal arrangements between the UK and Australia?
Well, I'll deal with the second one first. I mean, it's obviously the case that we want to see some of the current settings continue. I think the picture around migration, the exit from the European Union, and the role that migration's played in the public debate here for a long period of time, I suspect we'll see pressures for some of those settings to change in the future. I think that's a reality of the current dynamics. So we'll be an active participant in that discussion, and certainly from our country's perspective, whether it's intercompany transfers, whatever the case might be, we'll continue to work closely together. So I'm certainly of the view that that'll be beneficial to both of our countries. To deal with the first issue, we made a decision, and again I touched on this in part in my speech, around the 457 program, because the brand of the 457 had become toxic in the public's mind. Now, we didn't abolish that program and replace it with nothing. We replaced it with a short and medium stream entry. So people that would be your clients, you're speaking of, Katrina, there would be ample opportunity for them to come in through the medium stream, which in certain circumstances can result in a permanent outcome. Now, the question in part is whether or not you need to offer Australian citizenship to somebody to get a job or to fill a job in Australia. And I think because we have quite rigid labour laws, because we're a high-cost labour economy, I think the program for some employers had become sort of a walk around of the current rigidity within the labour market arrangements in our country. Now, the question is to try and find a happy place. I think there is the prospect of further change and innovation within the visa space. There is the ability for us to recognise the mobility that you would see in your clients' workforce, particularly with sophisticated workers and people who are coming in at the upper end of companies, both private and public, the capital that they can bring, the investment that they can make. There's an enormous leverage that we make off that already, but we'll continue to adjust those policy settings as we need to. As I pointed out, one of those essential limbs in our management of the program. So I think the criticism would be fair. In summary, I think the criticism would be fair had we not replaced with two streams. There are labour market agreements, all sorts of flexible elements to our settings otherwise, which can accommodate most sensible requests. But we've said front and centre we want there to be labour market testing, which there wasn't before. We want, where it's possible, to source that local talent, but we recognise that if that position can't be filled locally, then we're not going to stand in the way of that position being filled by a foreign applicant.
Thank you. At the back there, name and all.
Francis Maud, House of Lords and former minister, and also at the age of 4, 60 years ago, an immigrant into Australia from this country. It seems to me you've created in Australia this remarkable combination of what are pretty high levels of immigration with a high degree of public opinion consensus behind it. And you've argued, I think persuasively, that you can only achieve that by having very strong control, perceived control over illegal immigration. My question really is how strong is the political consensus around that? Is it under pressure and is it sustainable politically? And the second question is, do you have any advice for us as we move towards a position where we have total control theoretically over our borders?
Well, Francis, I'll deal with the easy part of your question. That is that I have no advice to offer to you. It's never a welcomed intrusion, having foreigners come in and offer gratuitous advice. So I'll leave that to the experts here. But to speak of the Australian experience, and I think through some of the examples that I referenced in terms of the European example, what's happened in Germany, it is clearer to me than it ever has been. And this is evidenced in the Scanlon Foundation, the longitudinal work that's been done there. You can track the public's attitude, and in our case, there's a direct correlation with an exertion of that, not just the sovereignty that's involved in it, but the pride that goes with it as well. When that is lost, and when Australians, because of our innate sense of fairness and wanting to help people, if they think that we're being taken advantage of, or that the rules are, and the strongest supporters of the government's policy are people who are newly arrived as migrants into the country, because in many cases they've waited a number of years in an orderly way to migrate to Australia. They're still anxious to get family members out, and like any country, there is a finite number within the program each year. Now, there's an interesting political dynamic to this in Australia at the moment, because the left of politics in Australia is still thoroughly divided about this response. And I think the default position, given the opportunity, would be to allow a much freer movement of people across borders. But for an island nation, unless you're prepared to put on endless charter flights, people will come by sea, and that's what results in the human tragedy. So it is absolutely essential in our domestic setting to have the public confidence to make the decisions around the generosity of bringing the 12,000 Syrians in, or having that biggest intake of refugees in a long period of time. So that's what works for us, and others may take lessons from it or not.
Thank you. Gentleman there, name and organisation.
David Goodhart from here, Policy Exchange. Thank you very much, Minister, for that fascinating overview of the Australian model. It's a model particularly in relation to irregular boat arrivals that would be very popular in Britain. In fact, I think would be very popular throughout the European Union. Can you tell me whether anybody from the European Union, as you know, the European Union has a very different approach to these matters, has anybody from the European Union or from Frontex consulted the Australian government about how such a system might operate in the Mediterranean? And how do you think it might operate in the Mediterranean? Also, the Mediterranean situation is somewhat different to the situation in Australia, and there is a more difficult question about where boats would be returned to. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that. Second, briefly, the main source of illegal immigration in most of our societies is not people arriving illegally, and I assume this is true of Australia as well. It is people overstaying visas, people who have come into the country legally and who have overstayed visas. And I wonder what you do about that issue in Australia, whether indeed it is an issue, and if it is, once people have been in a country for a long period of time, they acquire rights and so on. It's often very difficult to remove people legally. So I'd be interested in your response on that too.
Look, I won't go into specifics about who's sought information, but certainly there's been contact from some European partners who have sought, at least at a bureaucratic level, some of the detail around the sophistication of Operation Sovereign Borders. So there's obviously a significant intelligence piece within the success of this operation. The strategic communications aspect is incredibly important as well. So knowing the market and the way in which we communicate that message is important, and the disruption of that people smugglers product is central to it as well. The only other point that I'd make is that regardless of the geography, regardless of the dynamic, the push-pull factors, however you want to describe each component, what it requires is political resolve. And in our country, for that period from 2008 to 2013, there had been a lack of political resolve. There was already, under the Howard government, a solution that was in place. It was dismantled, and there wasn't the resolve there to resurrect parts of the Howard policy and enhance it by some additional aspects. Once our public service saw the resolve from the Prime Minister down, and once we maintained that resolve, and we've maintained it now for a long period of time, then the results were, forthcoming. So it needs that political resolve, and that may be a difficulty in the European context, given some of the components around turning back boats where it's safe to do so, safe zones. But I mean, Syria is an interesting case study where you have 6.5 million people who are displaced internally. The United States has cut their intake from 100,000 back to 50 or 55,000. The United Kingdom has a relatively small number in terms of the refugees that you'll take here, and there'll be pressure on that in time. The reality is that no country is going to take 6.5 million people on a temporary or permanent basis. And so all of us need to work toward some sort of settled arrangement, adjacent zones where people can be housed safely until they can return post-conflict and post-reconstruction, etc. And that needs to be a bigger part of the debate as well, because when the next crisis strikes, whether it's in the Middle East or Africa or wherever it might be, in parts of Asia, then we'll be stuck with the same problem where we feel good about taking 12,000 people, and we should, but there are 6.4 million people or so that are still stuck in a very difficult situation. So complex matters. On the second part of your question, I'm sorry, was the visa overstay. So our stock is about 60,000 in Australia. So bearing in mind that 40 million number of movements across the border each year, the exponential growth of that in recent years, it's relatively low. There's a lot that we do through through airport liaison offices in major hubs, where we work with partners there to take people off planes or deny them a visa. So we push the threat in our model well and truly beyond our own borders. We don't wait for people to arrive, make claims, and then get lost within our system. So we make a deliberate decision to push that threat as far away from our physical border as possible. And the stock of the 60,000, as you'd expect, turns over, and predominantly it's made up of students who are overstaying by a week. Somebody's fallen in love again and they've decided to stay a little bit longer, etc. So out of that 60,000, it's not a constant number in terms of the people within that 60,000. There are people coming and going all the time, but it is relatively low compared to the sorts of numbers that we process.
Let's try to see how many more questions we've got from this, where we've got. Gentleman there in the white shirt. Name and organisation, please.
Hi, Jamie Cater from GK Strategy. One of the most prevalent aspects of the immigration debate in the UK is the government's target to reduce annual net migration to below 100,000. And one of the most controversial aspects of that is the inclusion of international students within that. And I note that since the Night Review in Australia, there's been a steady increase in the number of international students arriving in Australia. I just wondered about your view, firstly, of the UK approach to international students, and whether you consider the increase in international students arriving in Australia to be a successful feature of immigration policy?
Well, for Australia, it has been a successful feature. I mean, there have been changes to that policy setting, as you point out, in recent years as well, but it's a significant export earner for us. It's a significant reach for us into whether it's Asian markets or further afield in terms of the people-to-people connections that are established. So it's an important part of our migration program, but I think there are social imperatives beyond that to maintain it. So as long as the integrity is maintained within the program, that is that people are going back when they say they're going back, they're studying as they say that they've undertaken to study. As long as there's integrity within the program, then I think public support follows. If people see rorts and rackets going on within these programs, as we saw within the 457 program, the public support just falls away immediately. So we've been very conscious of making sure that those policy settings are adjusted over time as is needed. But for us, we're satisfied with where the setting is at the moment. Australia has also seen, and I hope this is the case for a long period of time to come, but we face the inevitability of attacks like any Western democracy now. But Australia is seen as a safe destination as well, not just for tourists, but for families who want to send their children into a developed education system and receive that world-class education, but know that they're going to be safe at the same time. So it's a valuable product that we're selling, and it's one that we guard very closely. So, but for us, I think the policy settings are appropriate.
I'll just exercise Chairman's privilege 1 second.
Yes.
It was an issue which we touched upon fleetingly as you were walking in. We have a judicial power project here at Policy Exchange, just interested in reflecting on the Australian experience in terms of activist judiciary striking down democratically elected politicians' laws.
Right.
I was wondering if you'd care to reflect more broadly, not asking about the UK, of course.
No,
You're
but we
totally safe terrain of your own bailiwick.
for better or worse, we inherited many aspects of your legal system into Australia as well, including a generous offering in the appeals space and the ability for, particularly in migration law, for boundaries to be pushed regularly. Now, there's a big debate in Australia at the moment around the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and some of the decisions that have come out of that tribunal, and and my response to overturning some of those decisions, which is the ability of the Immigration Minister under the Act in our system. But there is an enormous amount of pro bono work within this space as well. That drives a significant legal cost for us in defending some of those actions. But look, the same debates continue in Australia as they do here about black letter v some of the activists, and particularly where these quasi judicial appointments are made within tribunals, where people are pushing a broader agenda. Then you do get tension with government decisions, no question.
We do work with Australian judges. We have Dyson Hayden occasionally advising us. So just so you know, it's not a blanket.
Very impressive man.
So, other questions I see that at the front, gentleman there, name and organisation.
Guy Thomas.
Organisation.
I didn't have one. In Australia, you're very good at being able to control legal immigration. In Britain, with Europe, with the EU, we've not been able to control legal immigration. This has created various social and economic discords in our country. How should Britain? How do you manage the issue between people who the tensions between those people who want to limit immigration in terms of numbers, come what may, and businesses which need skilled immigration under a flexible but fair system? I think your country does very well. What's the secret of your success?
Well, I mean, geographically, we're blessed in one sense that we have this giant moat around the country. But as I say, 60,000 kilometres of border to defend is difficult, particularly when you've got only a few kilometres across the top of the Torres Strait between Australia Territory and Papua New Guinea, our closest neighbour. So integrity within the system is the key to our success. If people can see that there is fairness, that there is an ability to cancel visas where people have acted inappropriately or against the conditions of their visas, and that is enforced, and that people aren't subverting the rules of engagement as well, I think that is what underpins the success of our program. So, and these are lessons that need to be refreshed. It seems periodically in our country, and that's been the recent experience for us. And as I say, the longitudinal work, it quite uncanny in the way in which it's correlated and tracks, and the public support has waned at times. At the peak of the failure of borders. The border policy in that period of 2008 to 2013, there are 1,000 people a week being pulled off boats, and the 1,200 people that went to the bottom of the sea. The public had completely lost faith in the government of the day, and so a restoration of the rule of law and good order is what underpins that public support. That's certainly been our experience.
How many more questions? I see one. Sorry. Last question, gentleman there. Name and organisation.
Paul Johnson, Australian Associated Press. So apologies, it's going to be an Australian question for you.
Sure.
Obviously this week, the first 50 refugees went from Manus to the US. Mm-hmm. I guess from comments earlier, you seemed fairly happy to see them out of there. At the same time, what is the long-term future of Manus, and is there, an opportunity for the conditions to be extended? Secondly, the United States President has come out and capped and lowered their refugee intake to 45,000 or what he wants. How concerning is it for you in terms of policy that large countries are continuing to do that moving forward?
Well, just for the uninitiated, so as part of the Operation Sovereign Borders construct, there was one of the very successful elements of the program was offshore processing arrangements. So an agreement was struck with Nauru and Papua New Guinea for regional processing centres in those two locations. Because the boats have stopped and because we've been able to return some of those people that have been found not to be refugees, and people have taken settlement packages and assistance to return back to their country of origin, it means that the populations in both of those centres has reduced over time. But nonetheless has plateaued, particularly with cohorts, for example, from Iran. Now we know that the Iranians will say we're happy for people to voluntarily return, but we won't take forced returns back, as the United Kingdom would, or the United States or Australia or New Zealand, if our citizens had been deported from a particular country. So we struck an arrangement with the United States where President Obama and Prime Minister Turnbull had reached an agreement where they would take people from Manus and Nauru, obviously following their checks and all the rest of it. And as you point out, the first 54 people have departed, almost in equal numbers spread between the two centres. And we hope that those interviews continue. We know that they will, and that the United States will honour the agreement. So that will see many people move to the United States. We've been very clear that the deal won't apply to any future arrivals. So if people smugglers are marketing this as a way to get to the United States, we've been very clear about the fact that it will only apply to those people who are on Nauru and Manus Island now. So we're very grateful to the United States for the support that they've provided. It's obviously like our relationship with the United States, with the United Kingdom. Our relationship with the United States is sacrosanct to us. It's deep. It's embedded across every aspect of government. So we'll continue to work with the Americans, and under the arrangement that was struck by Prime Minister Rudd at the time, specifically in relation to Manus Island, people that have been found to be refugees were to be settled in Papua New Guinea. Now, some people have taken up that option. Some people are employed, they've started businesses, etc. And PNG, as you know, is a signatory to the convention. So that's the arrangement that we operate under at the moment, but we've been clear that we want to close the regional processing centre by the 31st of October of this year, and we'll continue to work with PNG given that they're responsible in their own country for these arrangements, to see that closure by the 31st of October. That's what we're working toward at the moment.
Thank you. Just like to wind up proceedings now and just say thank you again to Alexander Downer, High Commissioner, for helping organise tonight, and to our brilliant events team, Amy Brecken-Simons, Ralph Buckle, and Martin Kendrick for organising all of it. Please join me in all of them in expressing. This is wonderful to welcome you here. It's wonderful, I think, for all of us to receive someone at the top of their game and to deal with very complicated issues with total clarity, with lightness of touch, but complete authority. And I think everyone wishes to join. We hope we can welcome you back here, hear further progress of your country's policies, which somehow managed to remain popular at home and abroad. Act of almost political genius. So thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you. Thank you so much.